Our stockholders have approved the ratification of the 100% performance-based stock option award to Elon Musk that was approved by stockholders in 2018.
Elon Musk's $56 billion pay package, which had been revoked by a Delaware judge, was reapproved by Tesla shareholders. And most Americans are actually pretty sick and tired of CEOs making way more than the workers who generate the revenue for their companies in the first place. And surprisingly, that's an issue that both Democrats and Republicans broadly agree on. You know, we hear about division wars. We hear about how Democrats and Republicans couldn't be more different from one another. But that's really a narrative that plays out in the mainstream media because they don't like to talk about the bread and butter issues that actually unite American voters on both sides of the political aisle.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why we think everybody is so polarized is because the stuff that actually gets oxygen on the mainstream media are the stuff that we're legitimately polarized about, right? It is the stuff about abortion. It is the stuff about culture war stuff, race and racial animus and that kind of thing, that gets people going. That's the stuff that gets oxygen on the news to create this sense that Americans just can't get it together. We don't agree on anything. We can't unite around a single cause. And that's why the people in Washington are so, stuck in the mud and can't get anything done. But the reality is there's plenty of stuff, what they used to call in politics bread and butter issues that Americans are wholly united on. Think about stuff like healthcare. And yeah, I'm not surprised that CEO pay, fat cat pay, and the discrepancies between them and the people who actually, toil to create the wealth. I'm not surprised that we're in lockstep on that.
Yeah, and look, I'm not one of these people who totally minimizes the role of a CEO, right? Like I think that sometimes there's this take, especially those among the far left, that like anyone can do the CEO's job. No, I mean, it's a really difficult job. And so I acknowledge that. And they do deserve to get paid a little more than the workers do to some extent. However, $56 billion, the average entry-level Tesla worker makes between, I believe it's $22 an hour to $36 an hour. And so that discrepancy, that giant gap is where the frustration lies. And here's how the data breaks down. Thanks to a Bentley University-Gallup poll. They found that more than 8 in 10, 83% of Americans say it's important for businesses to avoid a major pay gap between CEOs and average employees. That includes 56% who say the issue is extremely important. Only 13% say that companies are doing a good or excellent job at avoiding a major pay gap between CEOs and average employees. The 13% of Americans who make up this part of the survey are executives. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know who they are, but it's a tiny percentage compared to the 83% who think it's important for businesses to avoid a pay gap like this. And so let's go to the rest of that graphic where they think that these companies are doing a good or excellent job at avoiding a major pay gap between CEOs and average employees. For the third year in a row, though, the vast majority, 66%, say companies are doing a poor job here. And politically, the majority of Democrats, 96%, independents, 83%, and even Republicans, 67%, agree that it is important to avoid major pay gaps. So look, that's surprising enough, but the data actually gets even more fascinating. Before I get to that though, Waz, thoughts on these high numbers? I actually think you always have really good insight in regard to where Republicans stand on these issues.
Pausing here to deliver some honest truth as we do in our news coverage as well. TYT is facing challenges, guys, as the entire industry is. You know who could make the difference? You. If you hit the join button below, it's gonna make all the difference and keep us in business. We appreciate you, thank you.
Were you surprised to see that 67% of Republicans in this survey feel that it's important for companies to avoid these types of pay gaps?
No, because I think even Republican voters can see that there's been a straight up stagnation on what the average worker can achieve with their salary. We talk about Joe Biden's economy all the time. And even if you're a Republican, you can see that from your job, whatever it is you do for work, it's harder to buy a car. It's harder to buy a house, God forbid. It's harder to put your kid, in college. Like your job used to be able to pay for those things. And when you see that you can no longer pay for the things that your parents quite easily and comfortably did on one freaking salary, might I add, it's not hard to see this. And also it jives with the actual truth and reality, Anna, which is that, yes, back in the 60s, back in the 70s, the gap was way shorter between CEOs and workers, like starting in the 1980s, started with Reaganism, thanks Republicans, really started with Jimmy Carter, but whatever, we won't get into that. That gap started to widen. And I think it's reached a tipping point where even the people who see themselves as quote unquote bootstrapped, see themselves as gonna be the next boss, gonna be the next rich guy, gonna be the next great American achieving this American dream, can see that, we've crossed the Rubicon with this thing. Like they need to rein this stuff in and spread some of this wealth.
Yeah, that's such a good point because I think, when you and I were coming up, when we were growing up, there was definitely more of this culture, at least a higher percentage of Americans who really believed in neoliberal economic policies because they genuinely believed that it opened up opportunities for them to be super rich. They thought like, no, I don't want to change the way things are because I want to come up. And they thought that those opportunities were still available. I mean, I remember growing up and thinking that myself. And then reality starts to hit and it hits you real hard, like a ton of bricks. And I think that now you're seeing an increasing percentage of Republican voters realizing that, look, we might believe in free market economics, but we also see that this system is pretty much rigged against the average worker. And I'm glad that they're waking up to that. And I think that also explains the rise of Donald Trump, who, he certainly talks the talk, doesn't necessarily walk the walk, but the economic populist rhetoric, I think, really did appeal to Republican voters. And I think a mistake that Democrats made was their assumption that the only thing that Republican voters found appealing about Trump was his racism or his bigotry and xenophobia. I think there was something deeper there that I think if Democrats were smart, they would have capitalized on and used to their advantage instead of just smearing every Republican voter as a racist or a bigot. There's, again, more to it than that. Now, you might suspect that young people are much more passionate about the issue than older Americans, but according to this poll, that's not the case. So 70% of those aged 18 to 29 say companies are doing a poor job in avoiding a major pay gap between CEOs and average employees. That is similar to the 63% who said the same among those 60 years old or above and above. Wait, hold on. No, young people are definitely more passionate about it. So 70% say that companies are doing a poor job, and older people, 63% say the same thing. So yeah, that doesn't surprise me. And I always think about recent college grads. Like it's that season, it's that time of the year. You're starting to see those lawn signs that say proud of our graduate and all that stuff. And I wonder what these kids are thinking. I mean, they're adults at this point, but now that they're out in the job market, now that they're saddled with an immense amount of student loan debt, how are they feeling about what the job market looks like, what the pay is, and how that pay compares to the cost of living? So there was a report out today, I can't even believe this, but childcare is now more expensive than rent in every single state. Every single state. And we know how expensive rent is. So you have Republicans, with their hair on fire over the birth rate being so low. They want to encourage people to have kids. Why would you think people would want to bring kids into a situation where they have to work to make ends meet, of course, but they can't afford childcare? Make it make sense.
Yeah, I mean, even if you're a Republican, you should be wanting the government to subsidize childcare so that these people could go out and be worker bees and go slave away for their companies at higher rates. Like that would seem to make sense to me. And I think a couple of things I want to say. I want to say part of the awareness, the consciousness of this problem, I think we got to give some props to the Occupy movement. I remember back when that first all started during the financial crisis, and there was a lot of ridicule for these bums who don't want to work, who want to mill about the park in the mainstream press as describing them. But they brought that whole "we are the 99%," that whole dialogue and discourse around an actual elite, like pointing out that an elite in our country existed and that they wielded disproportionate power and hoarded a disproportionate amount of the wealth and privileges. That was not in our discourse in the Clinton years. That wasn't a thing. So I want to give Occupy props for even shedding light on the kind of on this kind of thing, that they're even commissioning polls to even ask these kinds of questions. And of course, we got to give some props to the god Bernard Sanders and his campaign in 2016 and 2020 for doing much of the same, for bringing light to this idea that like, yo, your paycheck just does not go as far. Like again, back in 1963, our parents and grandparents could be a mechanic, not own the shop, be a mechanic, own a house, take their family on vacation, wife don't gotta work. And now people are still working, by the way. People are still working really long hours, by the way, more hours probably than they used to. You know, people are at home answering emails at 11 p.m., from work. Well, you shouldn't. But yet their money is doing a lot less for them. Like nobody's stupid, Anna.
Yeah, of course. I mean, look, this is why it is, in my opinion, a massive mistake to brush off ordinary American workers who have a lot more in common with the left on these bread and butter issues. There might be some differences in regard to culture war related topics.
Yeah, they might not want a trans kid to play sports with their non-trans kid.
Right, so like that's a good example. Yeah, that's a good example of like an incredibly controversial, contentious issue that the left and right fight about, for sure. But when it comes down to it, in terms of improving the lives of ordinary Americans, we have to come together in areas where we see agreement and where we actually want change, where voters on both sides of the political aisle want change. And this is certainly it. This is one of those issues. So look, Americans have a good reason to be mad about how much executives and CEOs in particular are making relative to the workers. So in 2022, for instance, CEOs made 185 times the median employee's salary, according to an analysis by the Associated Press. And then it would take the typical employee 196 years to make as much as their CEO made last year alone. So people aren't dumb. They see that their quality of life has been diminishing year after year as they work harder and harder. They can't stretch their dollar as far as they did before. So the cost of living keeps going up. Wages went up a little bit in recent years, but still didn't keep up with inflation, clearly. And so when they see these massive pay packages for the executives, for the CEO, and then they compare that to what they're earning, yeah, I mean, you can understand the frustration because the CEO does an important job, but he didn't do it alone. She didn't do it alone. You need the workers in order to generate that revenue. But right now, business owners and the executives tend to see labor as a cost rather than a revenue generating part of their business. And so here we are. This is what we're dealing with. And if we could just work together, I think we could actually find solutions to this stuff.
By the way, and most people, I agree with you, Anna, are not like me. Like I tend to have a pretty grim, I don't want to say grim. I'm skeptical of the genius that we, put on our freaking oligarchs and how smart they are at business and creative and this. We tend to make these people into superheroes. I think most people accept like, yo, you know what? The fat cats are gonna get more than us normies at the bottom. Most people actually accept that, but it's gotten to be so freaking extreme. And I think that's what this poll has reflected.